When we talk about climate change, we talk about carbon emissions, greenhouse gases. We talk about big companies driving the change. The power producers, the oil majors, the auto companies, the miners, even the Paris Accord and the G20s, which decides on global actions on climate, is decided by the big boys, the big countries. The solution, though, often lies at the grassroots. It lies at the local level, in a local community. The dialogue on and action on climate change will be successful only if it is participatory and inclusive. If India is indeed ground zero for climate change, and if India has to succeed in cleaning its air, taking care of its water resources, protecting its forests, it cannot do without the support of local communities. If India has to grow in an equitable, just, and a sustainable manner, it cannot grow without the support of its daily wager, the self employed, and its women workforce. To talk to us today on the social aspects of climate change, we wouldn't have found anyone better who can bridge the gap for us between the economy, the environment, and the society. Mirai Chatterjee is the director of the social security team at Self Employed Women's Association, SEWA. She's also chairperson of the SEWA Cooperative Federation of 106 women's primary cooperatives. In addition, she is responsible for SEWA's healthcare, childcare, and insurance programs. She was the chairperson of the National Insurance Vimo Seva Cooperative Limited and the Lok Swasthya Health Cooperative, and is actively involved in both as a board member and founder. She joined SEWA in 1984 and was its general secretary after its founder, Ela Bhatt. Ms. Chatterjee serves as chairperson of the Global Informal Workers and Policymakers Network. On WIGO, Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, and on the boards of several organizations, including the Public Health Foundation of India, Save the Children, Pradhan, and now the Schwab Foundation for Social Entrepreneurship. She was advisor to the National Commission for Enterprises in the Unorganized Sector and is in the advisory group on community action of the National Rural Health Mission. She was also a commissioner in the World Health Organization's Commission on the Social Determinants of Health. In addition, she was a member of the high-level expert group on universal health coverage set up by the Planning Commission of India in 2010. Further, she was a member of the National Advisory Council appointed by the Prime Minister of India in 2010. She was conferred the Global Achievement Award by the School of Public Health, Johns Hopkins University. Ms. Chatterjee has a BA from Harvard University in History and Science and a master's from Johns Hopkins University's School of Public Health, USA. Mirai, it's a real privilege, and a thank you so much for taking the time out to speak to us.
Thank you for having me.
Mirai, a large part of India's economy is informal, and policymakers have been trying to kind of formalize the economy. The economic definition of informal is someone who does not have a formal employer-employee relationship or is self-employed. So if you look at the Indian workforce, I think close to 80% or more of the 400 million workforce is technically informal. However, from a socio-economic perspective, what does being informal mean?
Thanks, Arvind. And just to bring you some of the latest figures, actually more than 93% of the Indian workforce is informal, is engaged in the informal economy. And if we speak of the women's workforce, it's more than 94%. So we're talking cumulatively of upwards of 500 million workers. There's never been this kind of census. So these are estimates from the government and various statistical organizations. So informal means, as you rightly said, no fixed employer-employee relationship. And the mass of informal workers in India are purely self-employed. They don't have any employer-employee relationship at all. So who am I speaking about? I'm speaking about street vendors who are purely self-employed. I'm speaking about home-based workers, a large chunk of whom are women workers, These are women who produce goods and services from the home, including for the large brands like Zara and Gap and so on. The largest chunk of informal workers are manual laborers and service providers. And within that category, the largest group are small and marginal farmers. And of course, in countries like India, it is women who do farming. They are the farmers of our country and are boosting up our agriculture. Of course, India is still a largely agrarian economy, and the latest farmers' protests, which have been beamed across the world, have only underscored that. Other manual laborers and service providers would include construction workers, and we are among the few countries in the world where women work shoulder to shoulder at construction sites with their menfolk. And then, of course, cleaners and all manner of service providers like domestic workers and those who provide various services like cleaning and so on in institutions and homes and so on. And the last category are small producers. These are what we call own account workers. These are people like craftspeople who buy their own raw material, invest, and then sell their goods in the market, or food processors, snack vendors, and so on. So speaking about the particular characteristics of informal workers, first and foremost, and particularly this is true for women, they constitute the poverty sector and the most vulnerable sector of our country. There are a few more laws these days, but basically they are not covered by labor legislation that provides them any measure of protection vis-a-vis working conditions and what we call social protection, or the International Labour Organization calls minimum floor social protection, which is insurance, paid leave, sick leave, maternity leave, childcare, and so on. So really, we are talking about the unprotected, vast labor force of our country. And if I speak about informal women workers, as you might expect, they are the worst off. They get the worst and most hazardous work that men also will not do. So there is a gender dimension to the poverty. So it's informal, overlap between informality, poverty, and gender, and yet another, which is now lately called intersectionality, which means that most of the informal workers come from the most deprived castes and communities and religious minority groups of India. So this is the socioeconomic profile, and their lives are characterized by insecurity of work and income. Today I have work, tomorrow I don't know how I'll feed my children as I don't have any work. So insecurity of work and income, poor food security, and often hunger, as we've seen during this COVID pandemic. Several of our members and their children have gone hungry. There simply wasn't money to buy food. And third, very little social security, as we call it in India, which is at least healthcare, childcare, insurance, pension, and housing with basic infrastructure like a tap and a toilet in every home. Basically, the basic standards for human life on this planet. And unfortunately, large swathes of our population who are informal workers are deprived of these, even after so many years after independence of India.
Mirai, since we are talking about sustainability and impact, how do these women and these small enterprises that you spoke about that they run look at the issue of their business and their work being green and sustainable? I'm asking this because when we talk about climate change and so on, we talk about big business, right? We tend to talk about large organizations. But as I prefaced earlier, the real change may lie with these small enterprises. How have you seen it, and how do they see this phenomenon?
Sure. So, first of all, as you would expect in a country with a large informal economy, there are millions and millions of small enterprises. In fact, these are what we call nano enterprises or survival enterprises. And typically, the enterprises that are owned, run, and managed by women are the really tiny or nano or survival enterprises. So the first thing I want to say is that these enterprises, by their very nature, by and large, if I may generalize, are both sustainable and green. And let me explain. When I say sustainable, I mean on two counts. One is in terms of financial viability, and because they have to survive, poor people can do more with less resources. We find they're very resourceful. There is a word in our language which we call jugaad, which I think roughly translates to resourcefulness, doing more with less, I would say, is the best way of saying it. So they become financially viable for the most part because they have to.
Yeah.
That's survival. And they are small. So
Right.
typically these enterprises would be family run enterprises like a small family farm or artisans where everybody in the family pitches in. So we're talking 5 to 10 people, uh, that kind of enterprise. And the second sustainability is people running their own rather than someone far away in New Delhi or New York running their business and they just being the last link in the supply chain. They have total control over the entire supply chain.
Right.
So for these two reasons, I say that it's sustainable. Then now coming to SEWA's own businesses, and you
Yeah.
mentioned that we have promoted more than 100, in fact 107 now, primary women's cooperatives. We find that when local people, particularly women, are the users, managers, and owners of their own small or nano enterprises, that's when they become financially viable. They have a stake in them.
Right.
We have set these up as cooperatives or collectives where the women are the shareholders. They are
Yes.
elected democratically to the boards. And typically, these cooperatives or collective enterprises of women have anywhere between 200 to 500 on the outside. One or two, like SEWA Bank, have in the hundreds of thousands.
Yeah.
But the average size would be between 200, range would be to 200 to 500. And that seems to be the kind of size that leads to sustainability and financial viability, and they're linked. If people don't have a stake, then it's very hard for it to be financially viable. So being on the board, managing all their finances, checking the balance sheets, these are things that women at the grassroots learn slowly, but they have done so effectively. And if I may say so, about out of these 107, 80% of these businesses are financially viable and sustainable.
Oh.
But importantly, they're all small and decentralized and local and grassroots. We don't seem to do very well in scaling up. And the other point I wanted to make is that most of these are green businesses. Let me explain. For example, erstwhile waste recyclers, women who go through the garbage, women and children, and collect recyclables, they have now formed their own stationery cooperative where from the recycled paper, they make pads and notebooks and so on. So that is a green and sustainable enterprise. Similarly, the waste recyclers collect all the waste from the street or the garbage dumps. Then they sell them to recycling units. So tons and tons of garbage, waste, recycling from recyclables from the streets and from our cities and towns and villages are like this, entering a value chain where they are recycled and Mother Earth is protected. Similarly, small farmers. These are not farmers who, grow huge monocultures of
Yeah.
maize or wheat. They grow some crops like rice and wheat because they have to for survival, for their own food, and then they sell the marketable surplus. And then they grow cash crops like vegetables, fruit, sugarcane, or what have you, cotton, and so on. So these are necessarily green enterprises. Of course, some of the farmers, unfortunately, increasingly in India, have been using chemicals, pesticides, and fertilizers. But now there's a strong push and a policy push also from our government to go back to organic. And the
Yeah,
other interesting thing is that large numbers of poor farmers in India are default organic. They're too poor to afford these
yeah.
inputs, chemical inputs. So for all these reasons, I would say that these nano and survival enterprises of informal workers, particularly women, are by their very nature green. They don't involve, trucking things for millions of kilometers. They're local, they're decentralized. The producers are the consumers, and the consumers are generally nearby.
Mira, if you look at the investor base, the global investor base, the global pension funds and the sovereign wealth funds and endowments, they are all fairly large. They have very little investments in India as yet, and over the period of time, they will increase their investments in India. Alongside all of these institutions, also will have fiduciary responsibility of following what we call the ESG, the environment, social, and governance. And in that, the social aspects, of diversity and inclusion and gender also will take prominence. And if they get sustainable, scalable businesses to fund, which impacts the social aspects of a society or of a country, they'll be very, very interested. So in your work experience, and you're working with cooperatives and this women enterprises, do you see opportunities, and do you see opportunities which can be scalable if there is access to large pools of long-term capital?
Absolutely, Arvind. The opportunities are tremendous. And I think the current COVID-19 pandemic has only underscored that there are not only opportunities, but that how interconnected we are and how interrelated we are, and the importance of solidarity. Solidarity not only with the poorest of nations, but within the developing countries and poor countries, within the poorest of poor, who are women of our countries, who are poor, vulnerable, but extremely economically active. They are not at all risk averse. They're ready to take the next leap and grab any opportunity that comes their way. That has been the experience again and again, and underscored
Yeah.
even more during the pandemic. I think there are two things here. I think that often we focus a lot on scaling up. I think we need to ask the question, especially during having learned from the pandemic, what do we mean by scaling up? Do we mean setting up large vertical hierarchical organizations? Or do we mean scaling up this way, horizontally, laterally, where we have, as Gandhiji, Mahatma Gandhi taught us, the vision of several small or medium-sized businesses,
Yeah.
decentralized, where local people, particularly the marginalized like
Yeah.
women, have more control. They, protect them against fraud and all kinds of other things that happen in the business world. Everybody, even women's businesses. I mean, those things are normal. So I think, first of all, I'm saying we have to test that vision. What do we mean by scaling up?
Right.
And I think the pandemic has taught us that decentralization and local is the way to go. Having said that, of course, there's a huge need for capital, for investment. Our experience over all these years, even in non-crisis, non-pandemic situations, is that investing in women is the best investment you could make, particularly at the grassroots. And as is well known, invest in women and you're investing in the whole family and the community. And what kinds of things am I thinking about? First and foremost, I think the need of the hour is investing in women's collective enterprises to jumpstart their livelihoods, to rebuild their livelihoods. Women are resilient, but they have really suffered tremendously. In fact, all informal workers and migrant workers, as is well known now, have completely lost their income. if I can just digress for a minute, we did a study of our women's cooperatives, and we found that during the lockdown and the early months of the lockdown and pandemic, April, May, June, women said as much as 60% of family income was lost. But the positive part was 71% of them said they managed to stay afloat because of their collective enterprise, namely their cooperative. The cooperative, gave them some money, gave them food, relief, so on and so forth, and helped them also get continuous work. So I think the need of the hour is for these large pension funds from the North to invest in livelihood restoration, because once people have some income, then that whole cycle, they can buy food, they can send their children back to school, have healthcare, and so on. So livelihood restoration is number one. And what we have been saying to our government is to set up a livelihood restoration fund where people get access to working capital, loans on soft terms, micro entrepreneurs, individuals also get about 10,000 rupees a month, which is just over, I think, $1,000. And then they can restart their businesses like street vendors and so on. And we think also our government should attract money from pension funds and so on from the North. And women have always been very good borrowers and also pay back, as we know very well. Even at this time, when we gave some of our cooperative members working capital, the first thing they said was, don't worry, we'll pay back. Even if it's a zero interest loan or if it's a low interest loan, we are paying back. We understand that this also has to go to other women like ourselves. So livelihood restoration fund. Second important need is social protection or social security. For example, microinsurance,
yes,
which you had also mentioned. Large numbers of people were uninsured during the COVID pandemic. Fortunately, because we have at SEWA a microinsurance cooperative called SEWA, we were able to work with insurance companies, mainstream insurance companies, and roll out some products that were affordable and that provided some protection to some families during the pandemic. But we need to do much more. These are small, if you will, initiatives. We need to scale up. And one of the things we've been saying to our government, and your own Mr. Ajit Dayal of Quantum has been very actively part of our committee. We had a committee set up by the insurance regulator in India. And one of the things we've been saying is please deregulate and proactively enable standalone microinsurance organizations like companies, cooperatives, and mutuals, which are local, which are people run and people owned, and which will quickly extend this kind of protective risk cover to the vulnerable population. So this is the kind of business, again, that would do very well with external funds, like say from pension funds and so on. And I'm confident that we could also provide a return within a couple of years. For example, SEWA Insurance Cooperative has been viable for almost 10 years now. It took a while, but because we needed the numbers, we need the spread.
yes.
But now that we are not taking any money from outside, but we need that investment to take us to the next level, to scale up. So in the case of microinsurance, scaling up is critical.
Yes.
How you do that is another thing, because it's all about expanding the risk pool. So this is another thing that I think that we need investment in. Yet another is childcare, which is one of my personal favorites. We have the issue of low women's workforce participation in India. And one of the major reasons is that they don't have access to childcare. Our experience has shown is that when you invest in childcare, like say through a cooperative, when you have creches, daycare for young children, then women's income doubles by just this one measure. And then, of course, she brings better food into the household. She spends for education, health, and so on. So you set up a virtuous cycle. So these are just some examples of where investments are needed, which is not only building human capital and social capital, but also makes good economic sense.
Mirai, you spoke about COVID and we saw the impact on migrants, and it was moving. And we've also heard and seen about people losing their incomes, and it's a permanent loss of income. And
That's
it
right.
has had its impact on the economy and society. Uh, do you think this will shift the dialogue? Like investors like us, we think about GDP growth, but do you think the shift will happen from GDP growth to sustainable growth? Like, will we start thinking about the Human Development Index as against economic development? Will COVID bring that shift in discussions?
I think we have no choice. If there's one lesson that we have learned from this pandemic is that GDP growth or measuring only GDP is insufficient. Many of us have been saying this for many, many years now, that GDP growth is insufficient. It's led to huge inequalities in countries like India. We need to look at distribution. We need to look at fairer sharing of resources, and of course, being mindful of our planet and climate change and Mother Earth. So I hope very much that this pandemic has driven the lesson home. Gandhiji, of course, recognized it long ago and said poverty is violence. It's violence by society on its own people.
Yeah.
And in SEWA, we are inspired by his values and beliefs. And so we believe that to be true. So if that be the case, then it's time to relook at how we measure, how we share resources, and how we deal with our planet. So I definitely think that we have to now move from GDP growth alone to sustainable growth, which has both concerns for the environment, putting people in the center, particularly the poorest and the weakest and most vulnerable, like women. And of course, no one is arguing against growth, so that is required. And governance. A lot in countries like India, we have the resources. We say we are a developing country, a poor country, but we have resources. We're not making optimal use of those resources because of poor governance. We're not able to reach the last mile. So I think the pandemic has taught us, if we care to listen and reflect, that local people have answers, particularly the women of this country who are poor, hardworking, but extremely economically active. And they're able to take risk. They're willing to go the last mile. They're willing to make sure that honestly, each person gets her or his share.
Mirai, it should be very clear to people who hear this that the solutions to climate change, to social justice, to sustainable growth lies in decentralizing and supporting those small, marginalized women and small enterprises. And as you've shown, that they are sustainable, they are scalable, and they're also return generative. And investors, global investors, should really look globally and especially in India in this space. So thank you so much for doing this. This was wonderful. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome.